In this mini-lecture we will discuss biodiversity, extinction, habitat fragmentation, ecotourism, and conservation biology. After reading Chapter 11 and watching this video, you should be able to characterize the scope of biodiversity on Earth, understand today's extinction crisis in a geological context, evaluate the primary causes of biodiversity loss, specify the benefits that biodiversity provides humans, assess the science and practice of conservation biology, analyze efforts to conserve threatened and endangered species. Biodiversity, as was first introduced in Chapter 3, is the variety of life across all levels of biological organization, including the diversity of species, genes, populations, and communities. Species diversity is measured as the number or variety of species in a given region. Ecologist assesses species diversity by examining both species richness and evenness or relative abundance. Species richness is the number of species in a given area, and evenness or relative abundance is the number of individuals in each species. Relative abundance or evenness is the number of individuals in each species relative to all the species in the area. For example, an ecologist might be studying species diversity in two different ponds. Pond A has 300 minnows, 345 guppies, and 355 frogs. Pond B has 25 minnows, 50 guppies and 925 frogs. While the ponds have the same species richness because they have the same number of species, Pond A has greater species evenness than Pond B. This is because the number of individuals is more evenly distributed between the species in Pond A compared to Pond B. Genetic diversity is essentially the differences in DNA composition between individuals. Genetic diversity is the means by which adaptation to local conditions is made possible. Think of it this way: if every organism was 100% identical, then there would be no variety to favor certain environmental conditions in which to pass on to offspring. In this way, having a rich genetic pool allows a population to cope with environmental change. If a population becomes too small, it may experience inbreeding depression, which is when individuals in a population mate with close relatives and produce weak or defective offspring. This is why endangered populations need to be monitored carefully, because if their population gets too small, it may not be able to recover no matter what humans do to try to help. Ecosystem diversity refers to the number, variety and size of ecosystems within an area. Some scientists include biotic communities and habitats in this category as well. For example, a mountainside, from the top of the mountain to the valley at the base, has higher ecosystem diversity than a desert landscape. It is not new knowledge that humans are altering the landscape and in the process reducing biodiversity. However, there are also many scientists and professionals working tirelessly to preserve the biodiversity that still remains. Biodiversity exists below the level of species. There are subspecies, which are populations of a species that occurs in different geographic areas and differ from others in their species by a distinct characteristic. Subspecies develop in the same way that new species develop, which is largely through geographic separation, mutations and natural selection. The divergence from the species that creates subspecies, however, stops short of creating a new species entirely. Subspecies are denoted by a third term to the scientific name that follows after the species term, such that when you look at a scientific name of a subspecies you should see first the genus, second the species name, and third the subspecies name. Bengal and Siberian tigers are examples of subspecies of the species Tigris. A little closer to home, in the US there are 24 subspecies of gray wolf. The link on this slide will take you to a table that describes each subspecies, one of which was found in Texas until it was declared extinct in 1942. What you'll notice on the table if you follow the hyperlink is that the majority of the subspecies of gray wolf are either endangered or extinct, likely due to habitat fragmentation and destruction. While there is a great diversity of life on the planet, the number of species in each group is not the same. The image on the left is a scaled representation of the distribution of species among taxonomic groups. By far, there are many more species of insects than any other type of organism. Even with the insect group, There is not even distribution of species, as 40% of all insects are beetles. This image should convey the disparity in species richness between various groups. Notice how much smaller the animal group is than the protist or arachnid group. Does this surprise you? In addition to not being spread evenly between taxonomic groups, species are also not evenly distributed geographically. Latitudinal gradients greatly influence species diversity, which shouldn't be a surprise. Think about the tropical rainforest and what you've already learned about that biome. The tropical rainforest has the most biodiversity of all the other biomes because it is closest to the equator, and this geographic position favors a rich variety of life. This trend is known as the latitudinal gradient in species richness and follows that species richness increases as it approaches the equator. As you're well aware, human actions are causing a sixth mass extinction. While extinction is a natural occurrence, the extinction rate today is 100 to 1,000 times higher than the background extinction rate, that is the natural rate of extinction. While you should already know that extinction is the loss of all individuals of a species, you may not know about extirpation. Extirpation is the loss of a population from a specific area, but not the complete loss of the species on the entire planet. For example, black rhinoceros is extirpated in much of its historical habitat in Africa, but as a whole this species is still with us. Interesting to note though is that in 2011, a subspecies of the black rhinoceros, the western black rhinoceros, was declared extinct. Texas was in the news over the summer because a rich oil tycoon won a lottery and paid $350,000 to kill an endangered black rhino in Namibia. I've given you a link to that story if you'd care to read it. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, ICUN, maintains a list of species for which the threat of extinction is very high. This list is called the Red List. As of 2015, 26% of mammalian species, 13.43% of bird species, and 41% of amphibian species are threatened with extinction. In 2014 there were 22,413 species on the list. In 2015 there are 22,784. These numbers are estimates and it's suspected that the number of threatened species could be even higher, but insufficient data keeps us from knowing exactly. Biodiversity is reduced when species go extinct, but it is also reduced when populations reduce in number. When species decline in number, their natural geographic range is usually decreasing as well, so we are not only losing the species, but also the ecosystem in which they live. Scientists use the Living Planet Index to measure and quantify the loss of species and their habitats. This index summarizes trends in population sizes and acts as an indicator of global biodiversity. Between 1970 and 2008, the index fell by 28%, which means that on average species populations are 28% smaller now than they were in the 1970s. The greatest losses have been seen in the tropical regions, where the index has decreased by 61% in that time frame. There are several major causes of biodiversity loss. These causes are habitat loss, pollution, overharvesting, invasive species, and climate change. Habitat loss is by far the greatest contributing factor to biodiversity loss. As we develop land for housing, industry, commerce, agriculture, or any other use, we destroy habitat of native species. Habitat loss usually occurs gradually in a piecemeal process, causing greater and greater habitat fragmentation as human development expands. Habitat fragmentation occurs as our development creates larger and larger gaps between islands of remaining habitat, as can be seen in the figure on the left. Gradually the gaps become larger and the small islands of habitat that remain become more and more isolated. This concept of habitat fragmentation and the problems it causes is discussed further in Chapter 12. The other main causes of biodiversity loss are pollution, overharvesting, invasive species, and climate change. Air pollution can degrade habitats and cause harm to the bodies of organisms just as it does for us. Recently a sea otter at the Seattle Aquarium was diagnosed with asthma. They've taught the otter to use an inhaler, and while that may sound cute, The story has a much more serious tone than may first appear. Following Leopold's land ethic, our health is tied to the health of the land and the other inhabitants of the land. That we have now seen the first reported case of a sea otter with asthma reaffirms what we see in the humans. Asthma's cases are up 25% over the last decade, and many studies attribute this to air pollution. When animals have health problems, so will we. Heavy metals, toxic chemicals, endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and other harmful contaminants in the water, air, soil and their food can also harm organisms. We will discuss toxic chemicals and endocrine disruptors in Chapter 14. Pollution can also come in the form of litter and trash in their ecosystems. Plastic trash is especially dangerous to animals because they can become entangled in it and drown if they are in water or be choked if they are on land. Oil spills are also a dangerous form of pollution that harms wildlife. Overharvesting, meaning hunting and killing wildlife, is obviously will reduce their numbers. Over generations a variety of bans on hunting various animals have been put in place to try to save species being hunted to extinction, but poaching, or the illegal hunting, killing, or capturing of an animal, still occurs after bans are put in place. You can see the consequences of biodiversity loss are expansive. We lose food sources, tourism and recreation benefits, sources of medicines, and aesthetic and spiritual ties with nature. This can lead to economic losses because all of these losses represent losses of market or non-market values. There would also be negative externalities as our health would be adversely affected and in some cases culture and society could be disrupted. Finally, loss of biodiversity is intricately tied to loss of ecosystem services, which in turn is linked to our economy, society, and health. Now let's look at invasive species in more detail. Invasive species are species that are accidentally or intentionally introduced into a new area and who subsequently cause economic, environmental, or human health problems. Not all introduced species are invasive. There are some introduced species that actually add value to the ecosystem, humans or the economy. These species can be called alien, exotic, non-indigenous, non-native, or introduced species and include organisms such as horses, grapevines, dogs, and potatoes. Some examples of invasive species include zebra mussels, feral hogs, the vine kudzu and red-eared slider turtles. Zebra mussels were discussed previously in your book. These are tiny mussels that have invaded North American lakes. They foul water, clog water intake pipes at water plants and hydroelectric dams, and in general affect shipping, boating and swimming in lakes. Feral hogs are widespread across Texas. They cause environmental damage because they root around in the soil and tear up the ground. They also have no natural effective predators. Kudzu was a vine originally imported from Asia for erosion control along highway construction projects. Turns out it worked too well, and no, this vine covers much of the forest in the southeastern portion of the United States. The vine climbs over other vegetation and outcompetes it for light and other resources. The other examples shown here are sea lampreys, which are parasitic aquatic organisms that latch onto and feed off of the body fluids of fish. Africanized honeybees, which are an aggressive hybrid of European and African bees, and red-eared sliders, which are turtles that take over ponds and lakes and outcompete other aquatic organisms there. Invasive species are such a problem because they are opportunistic, have no natural predator, have various means of being dispersed, can live under poor environmental conditions, and are very good at reproducing. The final cause of biodiversity loss is climate change. We will discuss this issue in detail later this semester. Clearly, the diversity of the environment and its organisms provide benefits for our health and provide food resources. However, biodiversity also provides opportunities for revenue to be generated through tourism and recreation. Ecotourism is tourism that brings people to specific ecological areas to see and experience the wonders of nature in that particular location. Ecotourism can be a vital source of income for some countries, and it can serve as an incentive to preserve natural areas, reduce impact on the environment, and preserve local species. Some famous ecotourism destinations are the rainforest of Costa Rica and Belize, the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, the savanna of Africa, as well as the many national and state parks of the U.S. such as Yellowstone, Yosemite, Big Bend, and the Everglades, just to name a few. While there are some clear benefits to ecotourism, it must be monitored and managed wisely because too many visitors can degrade sensitive ecosystems. Cultural needs and traditions as well as local versus national priorities also need to be considered when evaluating the impact ecotourism. As I've mentioned before, not everything has a market value. Many people value the natural environment and feel a deep connection and love for it. This is called biophilia. The biologist who coined this term through his research cites this deep connection to the natural world as the reason we are drawn to parks, wildlife, why we have pets, why we seek after homes with beautiful views of the landscape, and a variety of other behaviors humans engage in which demonstrate our love for the natural world around us and the creatures which call the earth home. Similarly, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, author Richard Louv writes about how the generations following the baby boomers are suffering from what he calls nature deficit disorder. I'm sure you can figure out what this is. Children are getting less and less time outdoors and spend a greater portion of their time indoors on electronic devices. Research has shown that outdoor play and activity is linked to a variety of health, mental and spiritual benefits, such as lower chances of nearsightedness, higher levels of vitamin D, protecting kids from bone problems, heart disease, diabetes and a variety of other diseases, reduction in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, improved standardized test scores, stronger critical thinking skills, lower stress levels, emotional development and reduce risk of anxiety and depression, and overall just making you nicer, enhancing social interactions, and the value a person brings to a community through relationships they build. The scientific discipline devoted to understanding factors, forces and processes that influence the loss, protection and restoration of biological diversity is conservation biology. Conservation biologists are leaders in researching and developing innovative solutions to problems such as habitat degradation and species loss. In this way, conservation biology is an applied and goal-oriented science that has very implicit values and standards. Their work requires they understand the how evolution, extinction and ecology interplay in complex environmental systems. Conservation biologists work at a variety of levels of biological order. For example, conservation geneticists study the genetic characteristics of organisms to evaluate the status of the population in which they live. A good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Susan Hammerly, studies endangered birds. Through genetic testing of a Twatter prairie chicken, she was able to determine that the current management strategy a local reserve was using was inadvertently promoting breeding among close relatives. The genetic profile she developed for the population in the subsequent management plan for the bird she developed successively reduced inbreeding and significantly increased chick survival. An important outcome of genetic testing and analysis of an endangered population is the determination of the minimum viable population size. This is the size of a population required to maintain genetic diversity sufficient to perpetuate the population. If a population gets too small, inbreeding depression will occur, which produces weak and unviable offspring. Beyond the challenges associated with genetic diversity, conservation biologists can also address problems at the species level and the ecosystem level. In this way, conservation biologists work at multiple levels to preserve biotic diversity. The primary legislation in the U.S. aimed at protecting endangered species is the Endangered Species Act. This act prohibits private citizens and the government from harming an endangered species or its habitat. A specific term to this act is taking. Taking, as defined by Section 318 of the Act, means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. All of these actions are illegal under the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act has been fairly successful at rehabilitating some species that were on the brink of extinction. For example, A pesticide called DDT was found to be the cause of the rapid decline of various birds of prey such as the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon and the brown peregrine. Thankfully, after the pesticide was banned from use in the U.S. and these birds were listed as endangered, wildlife managers were able to develop programs to restore the population size of these species and subsequently remove them from the endangered species list. To prioritize areas for conservation efforts, research and funds, an international effort has been made to designate certain geographic areas in the world as biodiversity hotspots. The organization that maps out these hotspots is the non-governmental organization Conservation International. The hotspots are selected because they have an especially higher number of endemic species, which are species found nowhere else in the world. The criteria for being classified as a hotspot are: support at least 1,500 endemic plant species, and have already lost 70% of its original habitat due to human disturbance. At one point, biodiversity hotspots covered 15.7% of the Earth, however, because of human activities, they now only cover 2.3%. This map shown here illustrates the location of the 34 hotspots in the world. The image on the right is that of a ring-tailed lemur, which is a primate endemic to Madagascar. The species has lost 90% of its forest habitat due to human population growth and extraction of natural resources. Some people feel we have an ethical obligation to preserve and protect the species we share our planet with. How you feel about this question would be part of your worldview. As we've talked about, conservation biologists are working tirelessly to try to protect and save endangered species and habitats, but I want you to know there's something you can do as an individual can do. You can be a citizen scientist. There are programs for a variety of species that connect concerned citizens with scientists working to help the species. Citizens can do things like help collect data on the species or its habitat or volunteer to help clean up an area the species is known to visit. If you're interested in helping conservation biologists and other scientists gather important ecological and environmental data, Google citizen scientists. One of the biggest programs you'll find when you do this is the Citizen Scientist program of Scientific America. Some programs even have apps you can download on your phone and use to monitor the appearance of songbirds or other species of interest to the conservation program. The data citizens collect is then used to drive research for the protection of the species. That concludes this mini lecture on forests, forestry management and protected areas. Please review the weekly outline and complete the activities for this week per the schedule set forth in the outline.